हेलो स्टूडेंट्स, ये है फर्स्ट डिक्टेशन ऑफ डिफ़िकल्ट डिक्टेशन सीरीज़। 100 वर्ड्स पर मिनट की स्पीड रहेगी डिक्टेशन की। और पीडीएफ जो है मैं आपको अवेलेबल करवा दूँगी टेलीग्राम चैनल पे। चैनल की लिंक मैं डिस्क्रिप्शन में डाल दूँगी और डिस्क्रिप्शन में बाकी सीरीज़ के भी लिंक हैं, तो आप उस सीरीज़ को भी देख लीजिएगा, ट्राई कीजिए। डिक्टेशंस कैसी लगी मुझे कमेंट सेक्शन में ज़रूर बताइए। लेट्स बिगिन द डिक्टेशन नाउ इन 5 seconds. Start. For more than 50 years, well-intentioned and more cynical local and external actors involved in the attempts to bring peace and reconciliation to historical Palestine have religiously adhered to the two-state solution as the only way forward. The idea of partitioning Palestine between the settler movement of Zionism and later the state of Israel and the indigenous population of Palestine is not new. It was first offered by the British in 1937 and rejected by the Palestinians already then. The Zionist movement was hardly 50 years old and was already offered by the new British occupiers of Palestine a chunk of the Palestinian homeland as a future state. This in the 1930s and 1940s would have been an offer to decolonize India by partitioning it between a British India and local India, or to propose the decolonization of Algeria by dividing it between a French Algeria and a local Algeria. Neither the Indian anti-colonial movement nor the Algerian one would have ever consented to such a post-colonial arrangement, nor did the British and French dare to offer it when they reconciled with the fact that they will have to leave their colonial empires and go back to Europe. But even when decolonization was achieved in India in 1947, not only the British but also the so-called civilized world through the United Nations insisted that the Palestinians should give half of their homeland to the settler movement of Zionism. The Palestinians attempted to convince the international community that the Practising problem was not only about dispensing with half of their homeland, but that the settler movement of Zionism would not be content with just half of the country and intended to take as much of it as possible and leave it in as few Palestinians as possible. This ominous prediction turned out to be chillingly accurate and true in less than a year after the UN insisted that partition was the only solution for Palestine. Under the guise of UN support, the new Jewish state took over nearly 80% of historical Palestine and ethnically cleansed almost a million Palestinians, more than half of Palestine's population, and in the way demolished half of Palestine's villages and most of its towns in 9 months in 1948, an event known by the Palestinians as the Nakba, the catastrophe. In 1967, Israel occupied the rest of historical Palestine and in the process expelled another 3 lakh Palestinians. Like all settler colonial projects, it had to navigate between a wish to take over indigenous territory while downsizing the number of native people living on it. It was impossible after 1948 to repeat a massive ethnic cleansing, so it was substituted by incremental ethnic cleansing. The last stage in this process was one of the root cause that ignited the cycle of violence last week, the proposed eviction of Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah and East Jerusalem neighborhood as part of an overall attempt to Judaize East Jerusalem. Incremental ethnic cleansing is not only way of achieving the old Zionist goal to turning historical Palestine into a Jewish state. Imposing military rule in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after they were occupied was another means which enclaved the people there without basic human and civil rights. Imposing a version of an apartheid regime on the Palestinian minority in Israel is another method, and the constant refusal to allow the 1948 refugees to return completes the matrix of power that allows Israel to retain the land and disregard a demographic reality by which the Jews are not the majority in historical Palestine. The two-state solution offered for the first time by liberal Zionists and the United States in the 1980s is seen by some Palestinians as the best way of ending of the occupation of the West Bank and at least the partial fulfillment of the Palestinian right for self-determination and independence. This is why the Palestine Liberation Organization was willing to give it a go in 1993 by signing the Oslo Accords. But the Palestinian position has no impact in the current balance of power. What mattered is how Israel interprets the idea and the fact that there is no one in the world that could challenge its interpretation. The Israeli interpretation until the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu to power in 2009 was that the two-state solution is another means of having the territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, without incorporating most of the people living there. In order to ensure it, Israel partitioned the West Bank, which is 20% of historical Palestine, into a Jewish and an Arab part. This was in the second phase of Oslo Accords, known as the Oslo Second Agreement of 1995. The Palestinians were forced to accept it under American and Egyptian pressure. one area called Area C, which consists of 60% of the West Bank, was directly ruled from 1995 until today by Israel. Under Mr. Netanyahu, Israel is in the process of officially annexing this area while at the same time ethnically cleansing the Palestinians living in it. The remaining 40% of the West Bank, areas A and B under Oslo II, were put under the Palestinian Authority, which optimistically calls itself the State of Palestine, but in essence has no power whatsoever unless the one given to it and withdrawn from it by Israel. अच्छा, डिक्टेशन रही है 1000 वर्ड से भी ज़्यादा, तो आप देख लीजिए कि कितने मिस्टेक्स हो रहे हैं और कमेंट करके बताइए कि कितने मिस्टेक्स हुए। चलो आज के लिए इतना ही। थैंक यू, बाय बाय।